So, hello everyone. Good morning and welcome. So thank you for tuning into on this beautiful Sunday morning, and thank you for tuning into this session. I hope we all learn something new and just have a good time while at it. So before we begin, just a few notes. First of all, this episode is going to be recorded and available on our YouTube as well as on our website, and you can listen to the audio on major streaming platforms for the podcast. Kindly turn off your videos and mute your phones because that would help us with a better presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the chat box and we will get to those questions at the end of the conversation. For our sketches, please, when you're done sketching, it'll be great if you can tag us at layersofdesign_ with the hashtag layersofsketches, just so we can see all of your beautiful sketches and share them. You can connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest. Just look us up, Layers of Design, and we should pop up. Lastly, you can listen to this episode and all other episodes on major podcast platforms, either Apple or Spotify. Okay, so just a bit about us. So Layers of Design started in 2019 and we started as a podcast. We started this platform to share experiences of inspiring designers. This was just in the hope that we inspire the design profession. We recently became Layers of Design Creative Studio, which is a multidisciplinary studio that is focused on global community development and enrichment through design and architecture. We are passionate about design and designers that create an impact in society through their work. We participate in design competitions, we create podcast episodes, and we're always looking to engage in our communities through volunteer experiences. And I'm the founder of Layers of Design and the lead designer. And then I have Gabriel Diaz, who is also a lead designer and the producer for the podcast episodes. So great to sketch it out. I know I've been, talking about this whole week. Sketch It Out is a new series that's hosted by us. And the idea is for us to invite, everyone to be a part of our conversations with our guests while sketching. So as you may have seen, this is the poster for today. And this episode, we have with us David Rifkind, who, and we will be talking about how architecture represents power relationships. So to introduce our special guest, David Rifkind. David Rifkind is a knowledgeable architect and historian who teaches architecture history and theory at Florida International University. We'll get to know him a bit more today, but to quickly add, he plays a vital role in inspiring and educating students in architecture history, including myself. His curiosity and excitement while teaching keeps students and peers intrigued, and he's a professor that deserves to be celebrated. He's undoubtedly the best architecture history professor. So welcome, David Rifkind. It is a great pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Abehi. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Of course. So let's start from the beginning. What got you into architecture and design?
So I got really lucky. I discovered architecture in 10th grade when I was in high school because I went to a magnet high school for engineering and science. It was a public school in Philadelphia. And I think that they thought that they could get us interested in art if they taught art in a way that was kind of scientific or engineering-ish. So it was a class about architecture, and it was with Mrs. Nelson, right? So this is a long time ago, but it was basically the first time I started thinking about the built environment. And since I was living in a city that has a really extraordinary, kind of an amazing heritage of urban spaces and buildings, once it piqued my interest, I couldn't stop looking around, and I was the kind of person who loved drawing, but also thinking about social relationships. So that got me interested in architecture. And then I guess the other big move then was that, I studied architecture originally as an undergraduate at the Boston Architectural Center and practiced for a number of years. But then I also started to get a little bit disillusioned with the limitations of architectural practice. And that's when I decided to go back to school, and I went to graduate school, first for a master's degree and then later for a PhD in architectural history. And so I've been mostly working as a historian, and then a little bit as a designer ever since.
Oh, very nice. And what are some passions, I guess? What are some of the passions you have for the profession?
I mean, there's a lot of things. So one is that it's both what we do, like as an academic, it's what we do within the profession and then what we do outside. So what we do inside is actually, it's the relationship that I have with you and, you know, all of these fantastic students, or former students, right now, young professionals who are on this call, right? It's the opportunity to work with people who are themselves very passionate about the world and to help them realize their own capacity for shaping it. So I love doing that within the profession. And then outside, I really love being able to share what we do in architecture with people outside. And I have different opportunities to do that through different organizations and stuff. And I love that. I love talking about architecture and urbanism with people who are interested, but are not within our profession. And sharing that is, I mean, it's such a treat. So I really like doing that.
Well, that's great. I mean, personally, and I know a lot of my colleagues now, everyone talks about you and how great your class and how much we learned from it. So thank you for that and for sharing your passion with us. So everyone knows we're going to be sketching the 1925 Miami Dade Courthouse. And I know, David Rifkind, you had mentioned that you had a sketching technique. Maybe you can show that to us now.
Sure. I was going to, and yeah, if you can leave the image as big as possible, I was just going to invite everybody to start sketching out the building. And what I was going to recommend was that, especially if it's been a while, that the easiest way to, I mean, part of the reason why I like this building is because it's three-dimensional composition. And it's a seemingly really simple building, right? It's a tower on top of a two-staged base. But when you start drawing it out, you realize how complex it is. It's a series of boxes that are piled one on top of the other. But as you start sketching it out, you realize that there's some really kind of complex things about it. And one thing I'll mention about the image is that it's a really squeezed, wide angle kind of view. It's basically what my iPhone does. But it actually, the building, you kind of experience the building a lot like that because it is now, surrounded by buildings on most sides. And so you tend to see it like this, like, with your head back, sort of craning upward, looking at it. But I'm just, so one thing I'd suggest too, as you sketch, and I'm just sort of sketching it out while I talk with you guys, is just to draw it as a series of boxes. And then you start to realize that the boxes have pieces subtracted from them, right? So you start to cut pieces out of the boxes. And then the other thing it does.
Sorry, 1 second. Are you sketching it out? Do you want to show us the sketches? Because I'm not sure.
I'll do. Oh, you know what? I'll do that real fast. So I'll show you. So what I'm doing. Let me just do one more thing here.
Let me stop sharing for a second.
I was that's it. So I was just starting to sketch it, and I don't think I can draw like backwards. No, I can't do that. But the I wish I had like the overhead camera in a classroom to show you guys this. But so basically, you start putting it together as like a series of boxes. So there's the base, and I won't finish this until I start to figure out the other proportions. And then the middle part is where it starts to get fun, because the middle part is also a rectangular box, but it's got this corner that's cut out of it over here. So I usually draw this thing as a solid box, and then I carve out this piece. And then I start constructing the tower above, and so it's that simple as a composition. So if you start sketching this thing, you start to see how this thing. One other thing though I'll mention, and then we can go back to drawing, is that notice where all the verticals are, because even though the building is symmetrical in two axes, right? So it's a square in plan, and it's a series of concentric squares. When you see it from an angle, it seems like the tower is set all the way to one side. And so you get this cascading effect down here where these guys seem much, much longer. And that's where I always say, just trust what your eyes are telling you, right? When you see these things organized like that, even though you know the building is symmetrical, when you look at it three-dimensionally, it appears as if it's off balance. And draw it that way, right? Draw it the way that you see it. So if you go back to the big image, we can just start sketching some more, and then also, if there's questions in the chat about how to draw it, I'm really happy to answer those. So normally too, if we were drawing this live, you know, I'd be out on the site with people, and I'm just drawing some more here. I'd be out there and sort of like talking to people about the building and what they're seeing, and usually people, you know, it's not, we're not drawing this photographically, right? But, so I'm just going to do some more quick sketching on my paper here. And then, yeah, the other fun thing is that as you get up higher in the tower, those pieces that are kind of carved out and all get really interesting. They're kind of chamfered up at the top. And then the part that's missing, the part that we can't really see in this photograph, is at the very top of the building is this kind of funky ziggurat. So it's like a stepped pyramid. And you see that like when you're driving by on I-95, there's often like vultures hanging out up there. But yeah, it's a pretty cool building. And it's fun too, because the basic composition of the building is kind of cool, but then there's also, and I'm just sketching it out a little bit more here too, the basic composition is fun, but then you also get some really interesting details in it too, like all the classical ornament and stuff. And then way down at the, oh, and then the other thing I have to apologize for is I did cut off the base, but you can kind of guess just about how big it is.
That is the base of the build. Oh yeah, right here.
Yeah, all the way to the right. It's cut off a little bit, and then I'm just drawing a little bit more here, and then I'll go back. And then as you draw it too, you start to see that even though the building is, for the most part, symmetrical on two axes, there's some slight differences. So for example, in the image that you're showing now, the right-hand side that we're looking at is the main entry. And they have those entries on the two sides. We're looking at the south side on the right. There's also an entrance on the north side. And both of those have these kind of amazing inset porches. But on the two other sides, the east and west sides, there's still these kind of implied columns there. They're half columns, but there's no entrances there. So already the building starts to do some things at the base that are kind of interesting. It starts to guide you as far as how you enter it. And then the part that we're also not quite seeing as well here is that it has these fairly monumental staircases at the base, especially on the south and north sides. And those staircases just kind of serve to announce that, you know, this is a really important building. It's a civic building. And so I'm just doing a really, really fast sketch here, and then I'll show it to you in a sec. And so this is just getting back to that idea of seeing the building starting out just in terms of composition as a series of boxes that are stacked on top of each other. And then those boxes are then sort of, you subtract little pieces of them, like the corners in the second stage here, or the corners up at the top of the tower. And then as you start to pull those away, you also start to realize that there are things like the way that these middle portions of the tower are accentuated. It's not much. It's just that the stone cladding of the building pops out a few inches, but it's enough to give it this extra kind of verticality, right? Like it sort of emphasizes it being a really tall, thin building, even though the building isn't really that tall. So it's kind of neat. The other thing too about this building, as you start to draw it, you realize, well, you know, those classical buildings that it's based on, none of them were towers, right? There's no skyscrapers in ancient Greece, we're pretty sure. So one of the things that the architect had to do was figure out a way to make a building that was tall and slender, but using these classical elements, which is kind of a contradiction. But what they end up doing is creating these little temples at the top of the building, these kind of funny little Doric temples. And those are themselves the sort of the extrusion vertically of those center portions of the tower. It's pretty groovy. And so, yeah, you can also, as you're drawing it, you can start to add that level of detail up at the top. I'm just going to do that now. And another thing you start to notice probably as you're drawing it is that there's motifs that are repeated over and over. So on the base, there are, these big 2-story columns, and then 1 story of windows above that. Then on the part above that, you also get those monumental columns in the center. And it's a way also of breaking up the mass of that middle part of the building. And then up above that is that thing where you have the little bits in the center, that the sort of the center 3 windows that pop out in the tower, and then those go all the way up into those little temples up at the top. So there are different really subtle ways that the architect is breaking up the facade in order to de-emphasize how horizontal the thing is and to emphasize how vertical it is. Let me see. Oh, nice. There you go.
Oh, I was muted. But yeah, this is my sketch coming along.
Yeah.
Okay. So as everyone is sketching, and I'm going to leave this up for, for us to sketch, and I'm going to be in conversation with you. So we're discussing how architecture represents power relationships. I know we had talked about this a little bit before, but can you explain why this particular topic, why you decided us to talk about this topic, and why it's important for us to address or have this conversation in today's climate?
So it starts with, it's just how I think about buildings. And I've always been curious about the ways that buildings represent power and cultures, societies, ideas, even the way they represent philosophy. And I remember that even as a first-year architecture student, when I was like 17, I was already thinking about that. And it seemed like, for me, a natural way to think about buildings. But I also know that the more time I spend in the profession, that for a lot of people, that idea that buildings represent larger abstract things, whether it's philosophical ideas or transcendental ideas, or even something like power relationships in a society, for a lot of people, that's not so obvious. And so it's something that I wanted to talk about, especially that given today, we're talking so much within academia and within the profession about the role that architecture plays in a society that is still very much segregated, right? In a society in which there are still these kind of fundamental inequalities. And so it's something that we do need to talk about in terms of architecture, because we talk about it in the profession, right? We talk about how the profession and academia, how some groups are underrepresented, and how we have to basically increase the numbers of students and faculty, and also to mentor and to advance and promote people, women, people of color, and so on. But what we don't talk about are the very structural things within architecture that make that so difficult. Like, what are the things about building itself and about the built environment that always reinforce these unequal relationships? And so it's very useful for us to talk about that in the case of buildings. This one's easy because this is a building that represents state power, right? I mean, it's the county courthouse. So it's the way that the government represents its power in the city. But you can also see these power relationships in every work of architecture or urban design, even if there was never a designer involved. I mean, and it starts with just the way we define a building. A building is typically defined as a set of walls, and those walls have an inside and an outside. The inside is the included space, and the outside is excluded. And the right, the privilege to enter that included zone, confers upon people some kind of importance. Sometimes it's just the matter of, I belong in my house and I alone control who comes into my house. And that's a basic power relationship. Yeah. But you think about who else and who has the right to enter a building, or who's prevented from ever leaving that building, in the case of a prison. And so buildings are always talk about power relationships, who's allowed to pass through various portals. And in the case of a courthouse building like this, and also this building was built as a courthouse, but also it served as city hall from 1928 until the 1950s. And so this was a building where there were, there are a series of chambers inside the building that are increasingly reserved or exclusive to judges and to the mayor, people like that. And the building already announces that from the outside, because the building has these very simple hierarchies. Those symmetries always emphasize whatever is in the center of the building. Symmetry always does that. It always tells you that whatever's in the center is privileged and whatever's on the periphery is less important. And in the case of this building, there are these major courtroom spaces and then city offices that, because of their importance within the building and their arrangement, just by the symmetry inside the building, they tell you how important those spaces are as far as determining basically the rule of law or civic governance in the city. And so those are some of the basic ways that buildings represent power.
Yeah.
This one also, I just wanted to point out too, that if we were to set the Wayback Machine to 1928 when this was completed, it was the tallest building in Miami by far. And so this was a building that supposedly, according to newspaper accounts, you could see it from 100 miles out at sea when the beacon at the top was lit. So it was a building that, just by its sheer scale, really represented the city. And it was right next to the major train station. So when you first entered the city on Flagler's Railroad, this was, you come out of the train and boom, your head kind of goes back and you look up at this, this symbol of power.
Well, that was a great breakdown for this particular building and its relation to how, it's how it starts to define power. I personally am really intrigued by this particular topic because, like you said, architecture, it literally has the power to shape our built environment because that's what it does. And, just right down to the bridges or just even creating walls, like back then, how bridges or the reasons bridges were created, even the one-way streets. So for example, bridges were created to prevent, people of color from accessing, getting direct access into a particular neighborhood, a white populated neighborhood.
Yes.
And it was also used as a dividers. I mean, even in Miami, we have some cases where a whole community was destroyed to construct the bridges, right? And just the construction of the bridge under the guise of keeping a neighborhood safer or of promoting this seclusion, that alone just shows how architecture has the power to divide a community. And I do think the profession hasn't really been held accountable per se, because I don't think a lot of people even realize the power that architecture has.
Yes. One thing I'll mention about architecture too that makes it so useful, but also so potentially dangerous, is that it acts upon us in a way that is that we're often not conscious of. So as opposed to somebody who goes and tells you a story verbally, then you're conscious of them telling you a story. But buildings do that in a way that we always kind of receive almost in a state of distraction, right? So just walking the city naturalizes or internalizes some relationships that we don't even think about.
Yeah.
And so in the case of the spatial segregation that's a part of something like racial segregation, it becomes naturalized. The idea that that people live in different neighborhoods because of their ethnicity or their race, or their access to wealth or whatever, that idea becomes naturalized. It becomes internalized into us because the built environment reinforces it, especially because of the way those neighborhoods are separated from each other by things that seem natural, like roads or highways and so on. The way some places are connected, others are divided. Even things like the way that some neighborhoods have this really dense tree canopy and other neighborhoods have very few trees. Those kinds of things, very often the simple existence of them in the built environment naturalizes them, naturalizes that idea. And people don't reflect on it critically. It's as if things are supposed to be that way. So that's one thing that architecture does. Is it naturalizes things that are not natural. They're very much constructed and cultural.
I sometimes I wonder when or how that even started to happen. Like, just us as architects, because we do have the power to design those spaces. And overall, we're taught that our goal is to protect, the health and safety of the built environment and of our communities. So I guess I wonder, like, when did people start using architecture to, to project their own, I don't know, for their own benefits or to project their own racial biases?
It's always been, power relationships are innate to architecture. It's the way that architecture has always operated. And even remember that the simplest shelters also still go back to that basic paradigm that there's an included area and an excluded area. And even if you're just building yourself a hut, or even something mobile like a tent, it has an included area and an excluded area. And then when you start to put a group of tents together, because it's a family of nomads,
Mm-hmm.
that too, that arrangement of tents also has included areas and excluded areas. So there's always relationships of power that are encoded into architecture. Even the simplest and most ephemeral architecture has that. But the idea of using architecture to represent race and racial relationships really starts with the Enlightenment at the end of the 17th century, the late 17th century. And that's also one of the reasons why I was interested in this building, because this building is, this very self-consciously classical building. And what I mean by self-conscious is that, classicism is not innate to the Americas. It wasn't like the Greeks or the Romans came here
Yeah.
2,000 years ago. So anytime you see a building that uses classical elements, like this building does with its columns and ornamentation and so on, it's a self-conscious choice by the architect and by the client, by the people who build, everyone who's responsible for the project. It's a self-conscious choice to use that classicism to say something. And in the 1920s, to be fair, most of the time it wasn't really that well thought out. I mean, classicism was a sort of a default way of saying, okay, this is a civic building, this is about government, yada yada, but there are some other things about this too that have to do with national identity. And one of them is that, remember that America in the 1920s, when this building was built, was going through a fundamental change. 1920 was the year that for the first time the US Census showed the country being predominantly urban instead of predominantly rural. So for 150 years of independence, we had been this rural country of predominantly farmers. Suddenly we were predominantly urban industrial workers. And along with that change came other demographic changes. So there was internal migration, mostly African Americans as part of the Great Migration, moving into American cities, and also immigration of people coming from everywhere, from Ireland and Poland and China. You had all these Jews coming from all over the diaspora. So suddenly, and especially in a place like Miami, you also have a lot of immigrants and sort of migrants and expats who are coming from all over the Spanish and Portuguese speaking worlds. So you have this like really rich diversity in American cities. But I think a lot of people in positions of power also saw that as a kind of a Babel, like chaotic realm. And the
Mm.
danger for some civic leaders was that America would lose its cohesion. And remember, this is only 2 generations removed from the Civil War. And so
Yeah.
beginning in the 1890s, which is only 1 generation removed from the Civil War, they started using neoclassical architecture as a sort of a default mode for expressing a sort of a combined national identity. It sort of was the idea of creating unity out of all that diversity. But what it tended to do was privilege one very specific notion of unified identity. And it was that whole sort of realm of power that was represented by classical architecture, but was really rooted in the Enlightenment ideals of the 17th and 18th centuries. And to be fair, those Enlightenment ideals included the idea of national self-determination, right? Things like the idea that all men are created equal. That's a very much Enlightenment idea. The problem with the Enlightenment, it was also the period of colonialism. And so you've got this balance, right? So you've got, on the one hand, national self-determination, on the other hand, colonialism. You've got this idea of universal liberty, but at the same time, you've got slavery, right? And those contradictions that are sort of wrapped up in the Enlightenment the way that architects dealt with it was by creating a classical or a neoclassical architecture that was meant to represent some kind of idea of universal values. But in a world where you're still dealing with colonial exploitation and the enslavement of humans, that idea of universal values is understood to only apply to some people, right? And so those are sort of the ways that race is already encoded into something like the neoclassicism of, of our time.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. That's very interesting. I definitely learned something today. It takes me back to the history classes. So
Yeah.
with that, what would you say the role of architecture is in communities?
So one thing is we have to reflect on these histories, right? This idea that sort of at the very essence of architecture is this way in which we are always reinforcing power relationships, whether it's state power in the case of government, or religious power, or institutional power, or the power of commerce and capitalism. We're always reinforcing those power relationships. And when we do, no matter how much we try not to, we're also always in some way reinforcing the inequities of our system. So as architects, we have to start out by being conscious of that. We have to be willing to be critical of that as well, right? And you get a lot of that, like in the art world, for instance, a lot of artists, curators who are very concerned about the fact that they also represent and reinforce these kinds of power elites through the art world. So once we're conscious of that, then we can start to act upon it critically. And one thing we can do in architecture is to challenge the very notion of patronage. Who gets to be a client? I mean, typically we don't even think about it. In architecture school, think about how many studios you took. Well, I know how many studios you took. Think about how many studios you took. And every time there's just some kind of mythical client who wants you to build, I don't know, a really nice building that's a chicken coop that also has space for modern art or something like that. But there's always some client who's going to pay for it. And we never ask who are these people? Well, we rarely ask who are these people who have the right to shape the built environment, as opposed to who are the people who inhabit that built environment.
And I think bringing up the clients is a great point, because I think our profession is, it's almost dependent on our clients, just from the financial aspect too, right? So a lot of people could also be thinking, oh, well, I need to eat too. So why don't I just take that, but take on a client? But then what if that client doesn't stand for your beliefs, or, you don't feel like they are ethically responsible? So the challenge becomes, what do you do in that situation? Because at the end of the day, the client feels the need to get his project built.
Yes. And I should say too, that's why I am, I try not to be critical of colleagues who do work that can be problematic, right? So at this point, like I'm working on a project now. I'm designing another single family house. And I had promised myself I would never do another single family house, because single family houses are implicated in the whole process of sprawl. Which means that even if this house is a net zero house, which it's intended to be, the client is still going to drive there in their pickup truck, right? I mean, it's still problematic environmentally. Plus, it's also part of sprawl, which is also part of racial segregation. So I promised myself I was never going to do another single family house, and here I am doing another single family house. And so I don't condemn colleagues who work on that. I understand that, yeah, part of it is putting food on the table. But at the same time, I do feel like we need, as a profession, to call out our colleagues who are doing work that is problematic. There's a big debate now within the AIA as to whether AIA members should be allowed to design certain carceral, prison facilities, right?
Yeah.
If any at all. But also, I have a problem with architects who we often think, uncritically, hey, you're a member of the avant-garde, you should come and speak to our young students, right? And yet there are certain, let's call them self-styled avant-garde offices that have made a lot of money by building projects for, let's call them despotic dictators, or really problematic sort of titans of industry. And so if you are designing a building, and the reason why this is a problem is that when one of these avant-gardist firms and you're doing a building for the dictator of Azerbaijan or for the regime in Beijing or Qatar, the problem is that what you're doing is you're allowing them to take architecture, especially progressive architecture, and use that to legitimize their governmental system. And so there are these practices, and I mean, I won't call them out now, but they're doing these buildings that basically are being used as part of the state propaganda apparatus for authoritarian regimes. And these are architects whose work I like, right? I mean, there's a certain well-known British architect who just finished the new airport in Beijing, which was used to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the regime's rise. It replaced an earlier airport that's only 10 years old by another very avant-garde firm. I mean, you can look them up. But anyway, but the point is that these projects are not just, each one of these architects is convincing themselves that by doing something that's good, that's beautiful, that's sustainable or whatever, that they're doing something that's a net good to the world. And that's not necessarily the case. They're allowing architecture to be used the same way that it was used by Southern plantation owners in the antebellum period, where antebellum plantation owners used neoclassical architecture, like Palladian architecture, to build their plantation houses as a way of convincing themselves that they had this higher culture that prevented them from being charged with barbarism, because they also kept people in slavery. And so this is the problem, is that if architecture is going to be used as a way of concealing authoritarian regimes, for example, then I think we have to be willing to call out the practitioners who do that, because we can't just keep celebrating them because their work is whatever, so remarkable.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah,
I think that's where we all sort of get lost. We see this beautiful building and we forget to really analyze, okay, why is that building there? And, the style that was used and who exactly it is the building for. I think you already touched on this, but how can we begin, or how can we begin to teach or educate architects and designers, even the shapers of the built environment? How can we begin to teach them to fully understand and take responsibility for the cities that they create?
The first part starts with humility. It's really important for us to be humble about our own agency and about what we do control and what we can control and what we can contribute. One of the other problems with architecture, and I got to say, this is a problem with the way that I teach architectural history, is that I inadvertently reinforce this idea that the architect is this kind of really powerful technocrat who can create form that's then realized by builders, right? So like in the case of this building that I'm showing you guys, I can tell you about the architect. He was a guy from Atlanta. The funny thing was that about this idea of humility is that we have to be humble in the way that we understand how we shape the world, and that the way that an architect goes into a project shouldn't be that I have really strong ideas about how to build a chicken coop filled with modern art or whatever the absurd example is. But instead, we need to listen to communities.
Hey there. So I hope you're enjoying our first episode in the Sketch It Out series. So real quick, our next episode for this series is going to be on the 2nd of August. And if you're interested in knowing more about our upcoming episodes a week before, please visit our website at layersofdesign.online and subscribe to our mailing list. Now for this episode, don't forget to sketch along and use #LayersOfSketches so we can see your work. You can find the image that we're sketching, which is the 1925 Miami Dade Courthouse, on our website. Now, let's get back to this amazing conversation with David Rifkind.
The hard part, and this, I'd be really happy to open this up for a conversation with everybody else, is this what we do as architects. And it really starts with listening. I think it's probably the thing that we do the worst thing in academia is we don't teach our students to listen enough, to listen to communities, to listen to the people who are affected by the work that we do as designers. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we can do is, that whole process of learning to listen, sort of, and embracing that, embracing the uncertainty, the fact that we'll never fully understand the lives of other people, but that we can empathize as much as possible. I think that that's really important. The other thing too, if I can recommend, because there's some amazing people on this call, and I just wanted to say too that the other thing that you can do is also challenge the notion of how you're supposed to practice as an architect. So on the one hand, you do need to work for firms, you need to get licensed, because that gives you extraordinary power in our profession. But once you're licensed, you can also do a lot of work where you don't really wait around for a client to approach you or go after, RFPs that are submitted by potential clients. You can actually create projects. And that's where I would encourage people to build relationships with nonprofits, with community organizations, and start to see how you can help be a part of the way that they organize, the way that they do what they do. Even if it's a group that doesn't work traditionally in the built environment, there's ways that you as an architect can help them, basically taking what you understand about the organization of space, about logistics, about organization, things like that, and help, nonprofits, community development groups, things like that. That's what I would say is, as much as possible, build relationships with people who are doing good work and seeing how you can participate in that and use what you've learned as a professional.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, I completely agree. I think this is a discussion that, we as the younger generation also needs to, continue having with ourselves and be cautious of either who we work for or who we intend to work for.
Yeah.
Just give me 1 sec.
And I'm just sketching as we're talking.
Yeah. Okay, so I have some more questions for you, and this is based on your career. What are some of your biggest career influences, or what have been some of your biggest career influences?
Oh. So even though I had this question in advance, I'm still not fully prepared for it because I keep changing my answer in my head. And one is, all right, so mentors are important. And so I would really strongly recommend seeking out mentors at every level. Don't ever stop. And so the people who've gotten me to where I am include some fantastic mentors as teachers. Mrs. Nelson, I mentioned, my 10th grade teacher, my undergraduate thesis advisor, Eitan Fitchman, my master's thesis advisor, Alberto Perez Gomez, and then the people who mentored me as a doctoral student, especially Mary McLeod. They absolutely impressed on me a number of things, and not just how to think about architecture or write or design, but also how to really how to understand the positive change that I can make in the world. So mentors are important. And then I've also had some fantastic professional mentors as well, from when I practiced architecture and then now as an academic. So mentors are really, really important. The other thing too is just to continue the things that you learned as a student about the importance of travel and the importance of reading. Just keep doing that, right? Because you keep discovering new things that will transform the way that you think about the world. And so that's one thing I've continued to do.
And okay, so another question, can you suggest, let me say, 2 good books that are must reads for young designers or architects?
So I would say, especially for even if you are a first year student, there's 2 books about urbanism that I would start with, because I think it's, to understand architecture, you really start with the city. And so back in 1967, Edmund Bacon, who was the city planner for Philadelphia and the father of Kevin Bacon, Edmund Bacon published a book called The Design of Cities, which I first encountered as a teenager before I even got to architecture school. And to this day, it really has impacted the way that I see urban space. And then soon after that was published, that was in 67 and 69, Steen Eiler Rasmussen, the Danish architect and professor, published a book called Towns and Cities. And that's also just a sort of a really phenomenal, simple and very accessible overview of the organization of Western cities. And I think they're both tremendous books. And then I would just continue to read about urbanism, right? Like the sort of remarkable work by Spiro Kostoff and others. That's where I would start, is with books about urbanism, because to understand buildings, you really have to understand the entire kind of cultural context of them. And for me, that's always the city.
Okay. Okay, so real quick, before we keep going, does anyone have any questions, either about your sketch or the conversation that we've been having?
I'm just keep
Let me check the second. Yes. Okay. So they're asking if we can have the titles of the books again.
Oh yeah, I'll type them out. So Edmund Bacon. And then Steen Eiler. I'm guessing this is how the name is spelled because it's Danish. Oh, wait a second. Actually, I'm just going to look it up real fast. Yeah. So it's, yeah, Edmund Bacon, The Design of Cities, and Steen Eiler Rasmussen, Towns and Cities.
And okay, thank you for that. We
That's
got
where I would start.
Question. How can we enact policy change at the county planning level?
Oh, that's a great question, Claudia. There's been, so at the city and the county are really important, because as you already understand, that's where zoning is set, is by the city and by the county. And those zoning decisions are important because they really shape our cities, right? Like, I mean, as an individual architect, you drive around Miami and you just see like gas stations everywhere and single story strip malls, and it's kind of awful. And the decisions about how those end up there are made by city and county level administrators. So the way to start is by attending the county commission meetings and getting an idea of which you can do now virtually, right? So if you go to the county and city commission meetings virtually, you hear about how things are discussed. It's a lengthy process, but one of the things you can do is to start to make sort of build consensus around the idea of changing zoning. Now that takes a long time. That was how like the Miami 21 zoning changes, that took years of civic group pressure and then professional involvement in the process. It does take, those processes do take a long time, like usually years. But what you can do is if you can get enough, if you can build up enough consensus among other members of the community, you can get commissioners to propose changes in things like zoning. Especially zoning is really big. But there's other things you can do too, like at the county level, because the county is responsible for most of the major roads in the county. Not all of them, because some of them are controlled by the state, but most major roads are controlled by the city. And right now, most major roads are this kind of awful like landscape of concrete and asphalt. But the county is actually, the planning officials who are responsible for streets are actually very amenable to transforming them according to the principles of complete streets, for example. And so you can also start to just inquire as to who are the people who you can start a conversation with, like who's responsible for how streets are designed and organized, and then start to, again, build consensus among stakeholders like business owners, community members, civic groups for those changes. And what I found is that people at the county level are really amenable to those discussions. There's also some really wonderful county commissioners too. I worked with Eileen Higgins when I was chair of landscape architecture on a design studio project for a whole semester. And so there's a lot of really sympathetic ears in the county government.
Very nice. Does anyone else have any questions? Questions? If not, we can. We can keep sketching. If anyone wants to show their sketches, just turn on your video.
I want to see.
Let me stop sharing my screen for a second.
Hey, Daniela.
Nice.
Wow.
That's beautiful.
Wow. And you've got notes on it too. That's pretty cool.
Oh, wow.
Nice. And she's gone. Hi, Miss Daniela.
I do too.
And I'll share mine. I don't have all the windows on it yet, but.
Oh, hey.
Okay.
Oh, nice.
Oh, yeah. When I draw this thing, I rarely get to the point where I'm drawing windows.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the basics down.
Hey guys, I miss you all. How are you?
Hey.
Here's my sketch.
Oh.
Kind of light.
Very nice.
Nice. And you're using graphite. Nice.
Do you usually draw with ink, or how do you?
I mostly do. Like I use the Pilot V pens. Yeah.
Cool.
Not always. Sometimes I use pencils. Yeah.
Hey, David.
Hey, Fred.
How's it going?
Good.
I guess I'll show you my sketch, and then my daughter is sketching too as well.
Yeah. Whoa.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good.
Wow.
And so my daughter.
Hey, Leia.
She's a little bit shy right now, but she's done a few sketches actually.
Leia is a future FIU student, you guys. Wow.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Come on, Leia, say hi.
Nice.
All right.
If it was her brother, he'd be on screen.
Oh, he'll be on the screen right away now. I have to keep him outside the room.
So, the thing about drawing this building too is that this building is exactly the same time period as the City Hall building in Los Angeles, and which is the building that, of all the buildings that look like this, there's a lot of towers that got built in the 1920s for different governments. That's the most famous one because it's, you always see it in Hollywood films. But so the 1925 City Hall in Los Angeles, which is also the one that's on their police badges, that's like the same period and really similar building. But if there's one that if you really want to look it up that's super funky is the state capitol of Nebraska, also from about the same time period. And it's a tower, but because it's Nebraska, it's like surrounded by like hundreds of miles of prairie originally on every side. So it's a really super cool building. It's more Art Deco though than our building.
Well, if no one has any questions, I'm going to wrap up the conversation. I hope, you guys learned, because I definitely learned today, and I just felt like being right back in history class. It was a great lesson, even just the little I sketched. I'm going to add some more details to my sketches after this conversation. But I just want to thank everyone that joined the call. I apologize for someone hacking us. But nonetheless, it was a great conversation. And I want to thank you so much, Professor, for spending this time with us.
My pleasure. I feel really honored to be welcomed, into this. And I'm just going to take a picture of all of you guys and then post it.
Perfect. So, so our next episode is on the 2nd of August. And if you're interested in knowing who the guest is and the building beforehand, you can head over to our website, visit our website at layersofdesign.online and subscribe. And we'll keep you up to date with everything. So please tag us at layersofdesign_ and leave the hashtag #layersofsketches. Thank you so much for being a part of today's conversation.
Thank you all. And it's so good to see all of you guys. Miss you all.
Thank you guys. Have a great Sunday. Bye.
Thank you.